Bonsoir.
Good evening and welcome.
And I have the privilege of working at the International Development Research Center. Dr. MacMillan has been good enough to join us to help us celebrate the 40th anniversary of IDRC. When we think of development at IDRC, we don't think of one discipline in particular, say economics. We think of development drawing on many disciplines: anthropology, sociology, economics for sure, history, geography, geology even, all being tremendously important. And so when we thought of a series of very distinguished speakers to mark our 40th anniversary, we of course thought of history, and when we think of history, we cannot but think of Margaret MacMillan. And although, as you all know, she lives in the United Kingdom now, she comes back to Canada often, and we were after her for some time, and she kindly consented to be with us this evening. Vous savez tous que Madame...
No doubt you know that Dr. MacMillan is a history professor, that she has written some very important books. Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World is one of them.
In French with an appropriate title. Depuis, elle a aussi écrit un livre.
And since that time, she's also written a very interesting book on Nixon's visit to China, 6 Days That Changed the World, and the consequences, especially for China, of all of this. And more recently still, she wrote...
...of history. Et l'an dernier, elle a donné une conférence.
Last year, she gave a memorable talk at Carleton University on this topic.
Into dialogue with Dr. MacMillan about what she might speak about. We went back and forth a bit, and relevant to how the world will be developing, she suggested the notion of power, as we seem to be going through a very fluid moment in power relationships at the global level and the relative weighting of countries and perhaps even regions. She offered the notion that history might provide some clues as to what this might mean, or at least what it reminds us of in the past, which is always a spur to thinking. So, Margaret, without blathering on and embarrassing you further, the podium is yours, and after Dr. MacMillan's finished her remarks, she will take questions and answers, but I'll come back in at that point and mention how that's going to work. Margaret, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, David Malone, and thanks to IDRC for asking me to come to speak. It's a great honor, and it is an institution, your institution, one which I've admired and is admired around the world. It's certainly one of the Canadian institutions that is known of outside Canada very well, I think. I mean, people in Oxford, I think, have the highest opinion of it, and deservedly so. So it's a very great honor to be talking about this. When David first asked me if I'd come and talk, he suggested something on development. He's been kind about the negotiation. He said, what about something on development? And I said, I don't know anything about it. And we went from there. And so I suggested looking at the context, because development does occur within a context, and what will be happening in the world will affect the ways in which we try collectively to carry out development projects and the sorts of projects that we want to carry out. And so we agreed that I would talk about new powers and new types of power. And then, is history any help in understanding the 21st century? My answer to the question briefly is, yes, history is some help, but perhaps not as much as we would like to think. But that doesn't make a lecture, so I'm going to say a little bit more about what I think is happening in the world. I think we have a sense that we are living in a time of great change, and there are things that are new. And I suppose one of the difficult things we have to decide and try and discern is just how new it is. I think there's sometimes a tendency to assume that we are living in a completely new world, that none of the old rules apply, nothing that happened before has any relevance for today, and I think that is wrong. I think we shouldn't be dazzled by the newness of our technologies or by the changes which we are going through as societies into thinking that something like this hasn't happened before because something like this has happened before. We do have new types of power in the world, the power of the internet, the power of technology. These are powers which have existed in other forms in other centuries. Technology has always been important, but there has never been a form of communication quite like the internet, and I think we're still trying to understand what that means. The speed of communication, the instantaneous or virtually instantaneous nature of communication around the world, these are things which we haven't really had to deal with until this time. And that in its own way brings pressures, because when things can be known around the world so quickly, there's tremendous pressure on people in positions of power, people who are making decisions to respond very, very quickly. And sometimes quick responses are not the best response. Sometimes they are necessary, but sometimes it's better to actually take time. And I think there's often a very real pressure on policymakers from the public and from the press to immediately come up with a solution to a problem. And sometimes such solutions cannot be found immediately. And so, yes, I think there are new things happening in the world and new sorts of pressures. And of course, with the interconnectedness of our communications and communication systems and other systems such as electricity grids, there is indeed the power to disrupt is much greater. I think we have all witnessed and all been concerned about the growth of sub-state actors, small groups often operating in a very autonomous way, who have the capacity, partly thanks to the sort of world in which we live, to acquire sums of money and to acquire weapons, to acquire technologies, which they can then use in a very negative way to disrupt existing patterns of societies. I don't think they yet have the capacity to use those forces that they come into possession of to build up new societies, much as they talk of it, but they certainly have the power to disrupt. I mean, the internet itself is very vulnerable to such disruptions. I think also soft power, the sort of power that relies not so much on military power, not so much on hardware, not so much on resources, but soft power which relies on the force of example, relies on moral power, relies on the willingness or the anxiety of people to emulate you, is probably greater. The power of public opinion is probably greater in our history than it has been at any time in our history, because public opinion can be mobilized in so many different ways. And again, I think there is this pressure to respond very, very quickly on the part of policymakers. So there are new types of power, but there's still a lot of the old types of power. And power is a complicated concept, and there's no one clear definition of it that everyone agrees on. Power depends on possession of things that can be used to project your will onto someone else, to encourage or to force people to do things that they may not want to do, but that you would like them to do. And what power consists of has varied from generation to generation and from century to century. Power in the Middle Ages depended, at least in part, on the power of kings to maintain themselves in power. It depended, at least in part, on religious belief. In the 19th century, power came to depend far more on things like coal, steel, amount of population, so that the components of power will vary from period to period. And another sort of issue with power is how to translate it into actual power, how to translate these components into something that can be used. The United States was potentially a very powerful country before 1900, but it had chosen not to translate its potentiality, its potential power, into reality. It had a very small navy, a very small army. It had not yet moved into becoming the great military power that it was to become. So that we have always these issues of power. What is power? It's potential, it's hard, it's soft. I mean, these are things which may change in their balance, the components may change, but I think these are not particularly new concepts. I think what also has not changed, surprisingly, is the power of the state. I think there was a period at the end of the Cold War where we thought the world was moving away from state power, moving away from the nation state, states where people identified very strongly with their state. And I think we've seen that this, in fact, has not happened, that states remain very important in people's lives, in their capacity both to defend their own citizens or subjects and in their capacity to project their power abroad. And power, that sort of power, I think, still matters. I think also what hasn't changed perhaps as much as we would like to think is human nature itself. I mean, we get a lot of discussion about, is the internet changing what it means to be human? Are computers changing what it means to be human? But as far as I can see, some of the basic design flaws in human nature still remain exactly the same as they always were. And we can all have our own list, but I would put down greed. I think we've seen very good examples of that in the past 10 years or so. The motivating factor of greed is a tremendously powerful force in human nature. Our capacity for unwarranted optimism, to believe in spite of all evidence that things are going to get better. I mean, how else do we explain economic bubbles such as the one we have just had, if not with this tremendous human capacity simply to deny evidence and to believe that this time is really different. This time, it doesn't matter if prices go up and up and up and bear no relation whatsoever to the actual assets that they're meant to be reflecting. It doesn't matter if the stock market has a bubble. This time really will be different. And we've seen it so many times in history, over and over and over again. And so I think that is there. Our capacity to make the facts fit what we want to believe and not the other way around. So I think we are dealing with a world that is changing, but we're also dealing with some of the very fundamentals of relationships between peoples, very fundamental questions of human beings' relationships with each other, and very fundamental issues of power. So what are the challenges that we're facing at the moment? And I think you will all have your own list, and you'll probably disagree with mine, but the ones that at the moment I think are the things that we need to really think about and be concerned about. Well, the one which is probably much on people's minds at the moment is the financial crisis. And my own sense is that we are most definitely not out of the woods yet. I think the world financial structures have been given a shaking. The core of the world financial structure, the United States, for example, has been shaken, I think, far more than we would like to think. And if you look at the figures coming out of the United States, the recovery is slow, it's sluggish, it's quite clear that jobs are not being reacquired. In fact, the American economy is continuing to shed jobs. And again, we should remember that we've been through something like this before with the Great Depression. And it took 10 years before the world really recovered from the depression and the crash that began in 1929. And you could argue that it only really recovered because it had a world war, which for all its dreadful side was good for stimulating economies. But I don't think we want to wish to get out of our current situation like that. So I think we have a serious financial problem. It's not clear that we yet have the regulatory structures in place to deal with it. It's not clear that we are going to be able to prevent future bubbles, future irrational exuberance, as Keynes put it, from leading us into similar downturns in the economy. I think we also have, and these problems are none of them isolated, I think they're related to each other. I think we have a social problem. We have, I think, a very serious problem in advanced democracies in the growing economic gap in many such democracies between the rich and the poor, greater in some countries than others, greater in the United Kingdom and the United States than it is in the Scandinavian countries or Canada. But these are not good. Such growing gaps between the rich and the poor, which squeeze out the middle class, are not good for societies and are not good for the stability of such societies and lead to tremendous social strains. I think what is also worrying is a prevailing cynicism about democracy itself. The fact that in most advanced democracies, young people do not vote in the numbers that those older than them vote. My generation still tends to vote. The young are not voting as much, and I think that is worrying. And then, of course, we have the environmental crisis, the climate change crisis. I think we would like to deny it in some cases. I think we'd like to wish it away, but I don't think it is going to go away. It seems to me the evidence at the moment is overwhelming that something is happening to our climate, and it's a result of human activities. We also have tremendous international issues. We are living through a turbulent time. We're living through a time of transition. In a way, I think we got used to the Cold War. And it's funny to be sentimental or nostalgic about the Cold War, certainly. But it did have a sort of stability. It was like a Western movie. You knew who the good guys and the bad guys were, depending on, of course, which perspective you were looking at it from. And we now look back and we recognize that, appalling as the prospect of nuclear war was, there was a sort of stability in that very tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. We had two key players, and they somehow balanced each other off, and they somehow, like a rather sort of odd relationship, came to understand each other and came to find ways of dealing with each other. And that, of course, is gone. And it's not clear what is going to emerge to take its place. We had a period where the United States was the post-Cold War hegemon, where it really managed the world economy. It was the lender of last resort. It was the policeman of the world. And the United States, it seems to me today, is no longer willing and perhaps no longer capable of bearing what is a very, very large burden indeed. Now, the United States remains very powerful. I think there are those who say the United States is in decline, it's going to happen quickly, and I don't think that's true at all. But I think it is inevitable that the United States, sooner or later, is not going to be as powerful as it is today. Inevitable that other countries are going to grow, are going to be more powerful, or going to at least have the capacity for translating their assets into very real power. We see it in China, which is beginning to spend more on things military. We see it in India, which already spends a great deal on the military. And so what we're living through is a period of transition from one type of international system dominated by, in this case, one player, to another type of international system. And what we're not, I think, going to be clear about for some time is whether one dominant power will emerge to replace the United States as the United States slowly declines, or whether there will be coalitions of powers, whether there will be a balance of power where you get one or more coalitions uneasily balancing against each other with powers moving from side to side as it seems to suit their interests. What history, I think, warns us, and I think history can be useful as a warning, is that periods of transition can be dangerous, because powers that feel their power slipping away may be inclined to try and maintain that position, may resent that their power is no longer what it was, and the rising powers may be tempted to make hasty and dangerous moves which will alarm others, including the declining power. If we think of the period before the First World War, which in some ways seems to me to have very significant parallels with what is going on today, you had Germany rising and Britain clearly beginning what was to be, admittedly, a slow period of decline. But key indicators, for example, production of coal and iron, production of steel, which in the 19th century were measures of the industrial capacity of a nation. In those key indicators, Germany had overtaken the United Kingdom by the 1880s and was moving ahead very, very fast. And Germany was beginning to challenge Great Britain or the United Kingdom on the world stage, beginning to challenge it, with the building of its navy, beginning to challenge it in its customary trade and investment markets. And you could argue that that very, very difficult period of transition ended in the First World War, which is a gloomy thought. On the other hand, there was another transition happening at the same time, and that was the transition which affected Great Britain and the United States, because Great Britain was not just dealing with a new Germany that was rising on the world stage, it was also dealing with the United States, which increasingly was beginning to translate its tremendous economic capacity into actual military power. And that transition was a peaceful one. The United States and Great Britain had a moment at the end of the 19th century where they might have fought, and they thought better of it, and they decided to work together. And so history can offer both, I think, reassuring parallels and less reassuring parallels. But I think we can see that there is going to be, I think, a difficult time in the world. The European Union, I think, is not likely to replace the United States as any sort of hegemon. I think the recent financial crisis has shown that the European Union is in many ways a good deal weaker than it would like to be, and then that many, including the Europeans themselves, had thought it to be. It is not at all clear that the European Union is going to be able to move to any greater unity than it already has. And partly, I think, because the threat from the Soviet Union, which was so present during the Cold War, which helped push the Europeans together, is no longer there. And so there is less reason for the Europeans to want to work together, and perhaps more reasons why they would work against each other. There are also questions about what are the new powers going to be in the world? Who will they be and what will they be like? And many people have fixed on China as one of the coming powers in the world. And I think this makes sense. If you look at China's enormous growth, if you look at its tremendous industrial capacity, if you look at the amount of its exports, if you look at the tremendous trade balances in its favor, you can see many ways in which China is more powerful than it has been at any time since the 18th century. And we should not think that this is something new in the world. I mean, this is China perhaps resuming its rightful place in the balance of powers, or in the powers in the world. China is a big question mark, I think. It's not clear what sort of China it's going to be. I think there's a debate within China about this. Increasingly, at least in its public statements, China seems to be asserting a Chinese view of the world, a Chinese insistence that things will be done the Chinese way. I think a number of China's neighbors are rightly concerned about what this is going to mean for them. It was not that long ago that rulers of China saw themselves with a mandate to rule not just China itself, but the world. But that affected particularly those nations around its periphery. It also is not clear whether China is going to be able to contain and deal with the very real strains that its rapid economic development has brought to China, and deal with the very severe social problems, again, created by a growing gap between the rich and the poor, and also whether it's going to be able to maintain a government that works in the face of strong regionalism and also pervasive corruption, which is leading to, I think, a cynicism among the Chinese themselves about the nature of those who are governing them and the capacity of those who are governing them. We also have India. India, which in my view is perhaps more resilient than China because it is a more open society, a more democratic society, is potentially a very powerful country indeed, and certainly is exhibiting some of the same capacity that China itself has to translate its growing economic power into real political and military power. Russia. People have tended, I think, much too quickly to write Russia off. There was a tendency at the end of the Cold War to say, well, that's it. Soviet communism is finished. Russia itself is finished. And we all know the sorts of stories about Russia. We know the statistics on alcoholism in Russia. We know the problems that Russia has had. But look at Russia on the map. It's huge. It's got tremendous natural resources. And Russians have a very strong sense of who they are and a very strong sense of their own history. Bismarck once said that Russia is never as strong as it appears, nor as weak. And I think that is something that we should remember. And we can all think of other nations, Brazil perhaps, which one day might be able to translate their position in the world, geographical position, their resources, their expanding economies into more real power. We also have, in this time of transition, very real problems, apart from the financial ones, which are difficult to deal with, partly because they are difficult and often intractable problems, but also difficult because in times of transition, it is difficult to get people to focus together on what needs to be done. I think perhaps it's again part of human nature that we can only worry about so many things at once. And it seems to me one of the things we have not been worrying about as much as we should have been is nuclear proliferation. This is not something that has gone away. If anything, it has become more of an acute problem. I think we face very real dangers that Iran will get the bomb, and if Iran gets the bomb, then a number of its neighbors will want to get one as well. Nuclear proliferation, we also have unresolved and potentially very dangerous issues. Israel-Palestine, of course, Taiwan, China, India, Pakistan. I mean, there is a list here. And I think what we have to do is try and make some priority. We have to come up with some way of prioritizing these problems without forgetting that the other ones exist. Is history any help in this, or does it just lead us to further gloom? It can remind us that things which do look very gloomy, in fact, do turn out to be all right. And a lot of people did think that Britain and the United States would go to war in the 19th century, and they didn't. A lot of people assumed that Britain and France would go to war in the 19th and even in the early 20th centuries, and they didn't. And so it is, I think, possible to find in history examples which will give us at least some grounds for optimism. History doesn't, I think, teach us clear lessons. And I'm always very worried when people say, well, the lessons of history are so this. History teaches us that. History teaches us we must get rid of dictators because we know what happened when we didn't get rid of dictators like Hitler and Mussolini. An analogy which seems to be has much been overused is the appeasement analogy. that you mustn't appease dictators, that's a rule, history shows us that. It's not clear that history shows us anything quite that direct and quite that simple. So I don't think history offers very clear lessons, but history offers us in many ways about the only lessons we're going to get. What else do we have to try and make sense of our world, and what else do we have to look at the future? I mean, the Romans used the entrails of geese, not something I think we're going to go back to. Some people use astrology. My own view is that this is not going to help us really make up our minds about what the problems are and what we need to worry about it, what we should be worrying about. I think what history can do is offer us useful and instructive parallels. I think we should remember that no historical situation is ever the same as any other situation. I mean, history is not like something that happens in a laboratory. It is not a science. You cannot replicate exactly the conditions of the period before the First World War, or the period before the Second World War, or the period between 1929 and 1931 when the world fell into depression, or much of the world fell into depression. You can't do it. But what you can do is you can see similarities. And from those similarities, you may be able to formulate questions. You may be able to ask questions about, if we do such and such, will we run into the same problems they ran into in the 1930s? If, for example, we decide to cut international lending, if every country decides to pull in its horns, decides not to lend to each other, will that be good or bad? And if we look back at the 1930s, we can say it was very bad indeed. Should we invade countries and expect that we can build civil societies very quickly? Well, we can look back at times when we have invaded countries and realize that it sometimes is very, very difficult indeed to build a civil society and to carry out a successful occupation. So I think what history can do is remind us that things can go badly wrong. It can help us to ask useful questions. It can also give us, at a very important level, information. I think we underestimate just how important memory is in the ways in which we as individuals see ourselves and see others, and the ways in which we behave in the world. And we underestimate exactly the same things when we look at groups of people, whether they be nations, whether they be ethnic groups, whether they be religious groups. We are, at least in part, formed by our memories. It makes us, and it gives us rules of thumb. If we have had a situation in the past which has turned out badly, if we encounter a similar situation in the present, we tend to be wary because of what we remember. If we have memories of historical injustices, it tends to make us resent those who perpetrated the injustices upon us. If we have memories of past historical triumphs, and those can be very dangerous as well, we tend, perhaps dangerously, and indeed very dangerously, to try and find them again. I mean, think of the burden it must be, in a way, for the French to have been the country of Louis XIV and Napoleon. Every square named after one of the other of them, no, virtually every square named after one of the other of them, to remember that you were once a great military power, and to remember, moreover, that you were once seen as the center of civilization in the world. I mean, such memories can be burdens, but they are very much part of who we are. And I think we need to understand ourselves. We need to know something about ourselves. We need to also be able to look at our own histories critically. I mean, I think, I speak as a Canadian, I mean, we have tended to tell ourselves a story of being always very nice and kindly people who've never done anything unkind to anyone. And that's only part of the story. We tended, when I was young, when we did history in school, we never talked about what happened to the First Nations in Canada. I mean, they were simply not part of the story. And there was never any admission that perhaps there were some ways in which we treated the First Nations that really were wrong. We didn't talk about some of the ways in which we behaved unjustly. Now, you can go too much perhaps to the other extreme and do nothing but look at the black side of your history, but you need to examine it. And Germany needed to examine its Nazi past and has done so. China has not yet examined its past. They have not yet examined Mao. They simply leave it to one side. And I don't think that in the end is good for China or for the Chinese. I think we have to look at ourselves, warts and all. We have to know what it is that we have done in the past, and we have to understand that about ourselves. And we have to not tell ourselves that we've always been good and always been right, or always been victims, always been victimized. I mean, these are ways to push ourselves, or I suppose we're protecting ourselves against others, but we project then onto others what we see as They have been, if we're the victims, others have victimized us. And so we tend to see the world in these very, very stark terms. I mean, history, memory can be very dangerous. I mean, you think of the way in which history has been used in nationalism. Think of the way in which it was used in Yugoslavia by Serb nationalists, for example, when Yugoslavia was falling to pieces. And you got these stories about the great battle in 1389 and about how the Serbs had always been on the front lines of Christianity against Islam. These were stories, these were parts of the history of Serbs which many Serbs believed, and they simply weren't true. It was not true that Serbs, Orthodox Serbs, always fought against Muslims. In many cases, they fought as allies of Muslims, and it was much more complicated than the straightforward nationalist history would give. There was a wonderful French critic of nationalism in the 19th century who said, "A nation is a group of people united by a mistaken view about the past and a hatred of their neighbors." And I think there's something in that. I mean, history can be very, very dangerous indeed when it is used in that way. And I think what you do with history, what you must do with, is always ask questions. I mean, history is not just knowing about the past. It's, in my view, cultivating a skeptical attitude towards the past, asking, where is the evidence? What is the evidence for this? Why should we think this? Doesn't mean that you don't believe in anything, but I think it should mean that you ask questions about yourselves and about others like that. I think history is also helpful in understanding others. Whether the histories that others have are, in your view, true or false histories, you need to know what those histories are. It's very important, I think, to understand how the others whom you are dealing with, again, whether they be individuals or groups, how they see the world and how they are likely to react to what you do. The Allies, the British and the Americans, when they went into Iraq in the invasion and occupation, should have been more aware of the very deep suspicion with which Iraqis tend to look at foreigners, because the Iraqis have been through this before. They had the British who came in and created Iraq for their own purposes and tried to exploit its resources, and were not loved for it, not thanked for it, understandably. Not surprisingly, when the Americans and the British came in the occupation, a lot of Iraqis thought they were there to get their hands on Iraqi oil. And when the occupation gave out leases to foreign oil companies, this simply seemed to confirm for a lot of Iraqis that this was the real motivation behind the war. And so I think if the British and the Americans had understood something of the history of the Iraqi people, something of the relationship between the Iraqis and those who had tried to come in previously, such as the British, they might have been more wary of how they actually treated Iraqis. And they might not have been so surprised when the Iraqis did not open them with open arms, even those Iraqis who had been very opposed to Saddam Hussein. And so I think to understand the history of others is to get some sense of how they might react and some sense of what it is that they feel passionately about. I don't think we can understand some of the long-running disputes in the world: China-Taiwan, China-Tibet, India-Pakistan, Israel-Palestine, unless you understand that each have different memories and each have different views. There are no shared histories here, or sadly few shared histories. There are very different histories, and those histories make it very difficult for them to talk to each other. And so I think history can do that. It can lead to helping to formulate the questions, helping to look for similarities in the past that might help you to understand present situations, helping you to understand those who you're dealing with, and also helping you to understand yourself. One way in which we think about, well, one way in which we use history to think about the present is with analogies. And I think this is necessary, but they're dangerous. Analogies are necessary, I think, because we're often dealing with so many different types of information coming at us. I mean, here we are in the middle of a complicated world. How do we make any sense of it? How do we get any sense of what's going to happen? And we tend to resort to analogies. They say, well, this is rather like the world we're living in 2010 is rather like the world of 1900, or perhaps rather like the world of 1930. You can choose your analogy, and there are many different analogies that might work, but they can be helpful. They can help to give some sense of what it is we're dealing with and some sense of what might be happening. I mean, as I say, it's never going to be sure, it's never going to be certain, but it will give you some sense of where we might be going and what we might do to avoid outcomes that we don't want. The problem, of course, with analogies is getting the right one, and we often get the wrong one. I would argue that we have used the appeasement analogy, both rightly and wrongly, in the past 50 or 60 years. And the appeasement analogy comes from the policies of the democracies in the 1930s as they were dealing with Germany and Hitler, as they were dealing with Mussolini in Italy, and as they were dealing with Japan and its militaristic government, and a number of other smaller countries such as Hungary. And what the appeasers argued was that they should do their best as leaders of democracies to avoid another world war, because the costs of the First World War had been so appalling, and that what they should do is look at the demands of the revisionist powers, the powers that wanted to change the settlement that had been made at the end of the First World War, and see if they were reasonable. And if they were reasonable, accept them. If Germany wanted to unite with Austria, well, was this not reasonable? Was it not unreasonable that Germany, under the terms of its treaty at the end of the First World War, had been forbidden to unite with Austria, and Austria, under the terms of its treaty, had been forbidden to unite with Germany? Both German-speaking countries. Was it not reasonable that if the German speakers in Austria wanted to be part of the German speakers of Germany, they should not be allowed to do so? And so appeasement was, I think, an attempt to both avoid another war with all its appalling costs, which those in power, of course, were very much aware of because they were the ones who survived. It was also an attempt to give what seemed like reasonable concessions to those who wanted to change the international system. And as we know, appeasement didn't work. It turned out that Hitler's appetite simply grew with every morsel or every large morsel that was thrown to him, and that he was, in fact, bent on something much more than satisfying legitimate demands of Germany for adjustment of its borders or for relaxation of the restrictions on armaments. He was bent on something much more than that. And so, in the end, the Second World War broke out. And so appeasement, or Munich, have become shorthand for a shabby and dishonorable attempt by the democracies to give way to dictators. I think the analogy is trickier than that. I think you could argue that it was, in fact, an honorable attempt that was carried on too long. I mean, we can argue about that, but was it such a bad endeavor to try and avoid another world war? You know, after the Second World War, the West accepted that the Soviet Union had established an empire in Eastern Europe, accepted the fact that the Soviet Union cracked down on revolts in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, accepted that. And could we not call that appeasement? Now, we called it containment, which sounded different, but in my view, it wasn't actually all that different. And it was seen as a sensible policy, a policy of recognizing that the Soviet Union had certain concerns in the eastern part of Europe, and the West was simply going to accept that the Soviet Union would dominate the eastern part of Europe. So appeasement, I think, is tricky, but it's been used, and it's been used again and again and again. It was used, as you will all, I think, well remember, in the lead-up to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Very specific reference was made to the dictators. We've seen it, said Paul Wolfowitz, we've seen what happens, one of the advisors to President Bush, we've seen what happens when you try and appease people like Hitler. Saddam Hussein is just the same, and we must not make that mistake again. Because if we don't stop him now, he will simply gain in power, and he will simply go on expanding his power, and we'll end up having to stop him with a major war, whereas now we can stop him with a minor war. My own sense is this was not a valid use of the analogy that Saddam Hussein, while in many ways as dreadful a person and as dreadful to his own people as Hitler was, he was not a threat to his neighbors or to the balance of power in the world or to the world peace in the same way that Hitler was. Now, we can argue about this, but it seems to me that you have to be careful how you use the analogy because it can become a straitjacket and you do not look at other possibilities. I think there are times when the appeasement analogy has made sense. In Korea, I think you could argue that when North Korea sent troops into South Korea, and President Harry Truman said, I've seen this before, we can't let them get away with it because they'll just demand more and more and more. That was probably a useful employment of the analogy of appeasement. So choosing the right analogy is very important. And sometimes it can be useful actually to consider different analogies as you try and make sense of a situation. So I may be completely wrong that the situation today has striking parallels with the situation before 1914. It may well be that the analogy we should be looking at is the 1930s. Or the analogy we may be looking at should be really after 1815. It's difficult to tell, or we should go back earlier on. But at least if we discuss the analogies, it keeps our minds open to the possibilities, and it gives us some sense of trying to make at least some sense of what's happening today and ask the right sort of questions. Sometimes the wrong analogy is chosen even after a ferocious debate. I'll just give you one example. In 1965, there was an intense debate within the US administration over whether to escalate further in Vietnam. And the appeasement analogy was used. The North Vietnamese, it was argued, are again like Hitler, Mussolini, and so on. It is necessary to stop them because the costs of stopping them later on will be much higher. One senior member of the US administration, George Ball, who actually knew Asia quite well, said, look, I think there's another analogy we should be thinking of, and that is the French experience in Vietnam. The French fought a colonial war in Vietnam from 1947 to 1954 and ended with a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And they lost the war in part because they underestimated the doggedness and determination of the North Vietnamese. They also lost it because the French people were not prepared to go on paying the price of that war. They lost it because, as a democracy, they could not fight an unpopular war. And Ball said, we're going to run into the same problem as the French ran into. And he was dismissed, and his use of the analogy was dismissed with a rather simple-minded dismissal. But they were the French and we're the Americans. And we know what happened. I think it could have been a very useful warning. So what history can do is help us to formulate ways of thinking about the present. It can give us encouragement, and I think we may need encouragement at the moment as we deal with this sort of menu of problems that we have facing us. It can remind us that there have been previous moments of crisis in history where, in fact, we have made big changes, where we've done things that we said were impossible, and we have actually done them. Just to give you one small example, penicillin. How to make penicillin was discovered before the Second World War, but it was prohibitively expensive to produce, and so it was argued that it was impossible. It would never be possible to produce penicillin. Second World War came along, and suddenly it became possible. And I think we've all benefited from that. In the 1930s, it was impossible, they told Roosevelt, to put people back to work. It was impossible to have deficit spending, impossible to have vast employment schemes. And Roosevelt didn't listen to them, and we got things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which did, in fact, I think, begin to get the American economy going again. You think of the recent financial meltdown. Up until that point, up until that crucial week in November, it was said that it would be impossible to do anything about the banks, impossible for governments to intervene. The US and UK governments virtually nationalized their banks in about a week, having been told for centuries or decades that it was impossible. And so I think it is possible to see that we can make great changes. Sometimes it seems to require a very great shock. We did make changes collectively, as at least in Europe, at the end of the 30 Years' War, when the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 agreed that people would not interfere in the affairs of other countries, and that what happened within the boundaries was the affairs of the ruler. And the Westphalian system is one that, for better or worse, has lasted pretty much up until the present. At the end of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, there was a period of peace in Europe with the Congress system. I think because Europeans had come to recognize that if they kept on fighting like this, they would all be losers. At the end of the Second World War, you got Europeans who had been responsible for 2 appalling world wars, realizing they couldn't go on doing this, that they were very lucky to have survived at all. And you got really what was, I think, an unprecedented spectacle of states voluntarily giving up power to a supranational organization of what became the European Union. And we got the establishment of new international institutions after the Second World War, I think very much because we, at least at the time, collectively recognized that we couldn't go on with it again. And so I think moments of great crisis can lead to rethinking. I think we're beginning to think now about what went wrong in the last financial crisis. Although I asked an economist the other day, and I said, is there a great deal of soul searching in your profession? And he said, looked rather surprised and said, not really. We're just building different models. I've only got one joke. I can only ever remember one joke, but I'm going to tell you my economist joke as an historian. How many economists does it take to change a light bulb? It's an infinite number because they all sit there in the dark and wait for the invisible hand to do it. So I think we are in one of these moments where perhaps we will rethink what we're doing. The danger, of course, is that we will try and deny that anything really happened. The capacity, as I said earlier on, of human beings to deny the obvious, I think, is very great. A danger, perhaps, in relaxing too soon, thinking things will go on as they always have. We got out of this particular mess. We needn't worry. That's something I've been working a lot on the outbreak of World War I. And that's something that really strikes me about the collective mood in 1914, when the Archduke was assassinated at Sarajevo, there was, I think, a feeling another crisis. Well, we've had 2 or 3 crises in the Balkans in the last few years. We've had crises over Morocco. We got out of them. We'll get out of this one. And so I think there's a danger in complacency in thinking that this time we'll somehow muddle through as we've muddled through before. In the end, if history is any help as we think about this complicated world that we're in which we're going to be living in the next decades, perhaps the last thing history can do is give us a sense of humility. We can look back and we can see that there were very clever people in the past who had access to all sorts of power, who had access to all sorts of information, and got it very, very wrong. And that's not a bad lesson. It's not a bad lesson because as members of democracies, we should actually be questioning those in positions of authority when they tell us that they know exactly what they're doing. Because history is full of examples of people who said, trust me, we know what we're doing, we've got all the information, we've got all the information we need, we are getting it right. I've just remembered one more joke. And that was the rather sad joke that was told in Washington about 1968 when the war in Vietnam was going badly. And the joke was that in 1960, the computer, one of the early computers, was given all the information, huge amounts of information about the power of North Vietnam, its capacity, its population, similar statistics for the United States, everything fed in, number of guns, number of bullets. And one simple question was asked, when will the United States win the war? And the answer was, you won it in 1964. So I think what history can do is just warn us that we don't know everything, that we should proceed with caution, that we should watch out for the unexpected. It's not always clear when things are going to go wrong, that when we do have the opportunity to try and put things to rights, we should try and take it. And all we can do, I think, and this is a very sad, sort of gloomy note to end on, is do our best to try and muddle through. And history, I think, can help rather than hinder us in that if we use it correctly and if we're prepared to ask the awkward questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And, well, you can all see why Dr. MacMillan is such a huge success at St. Antony's College at Oxford, which she leads, a very fractious body which focuses primarily on international relations and every dimension thereof. And why we're so fortunate to have her with us this evening. Now, there are 2 microphones on either side here. For those of you who wish to engage Dr. MacMillan, please go to them. We also have people who have been following this on a webcast, and I have a question actually from them. But for those in the audience here in particular, I'd like to challenge you a bit. Earlier this year, there was a report out of a very distinguished Canadian institution that basically described the recent and continuing economic and financial crisis as a disaster in the developing world. Well, perhaps, but it was much more of a disaster in the West. In fact, the developing world has been doing relatively well during this crisis, including Africa, including much of Latin America, and much of Asia has powered on. So we seem to be projecting our own unhappiness on the rest of the world, which reacted to the conditions in our part of the world rather differently. So this suggests we actually may very much in the field of development be about to entertain a transition of the sort that Dr. MacMillan was talking about. Now, the question on the screen, without being held hostage by the discussion on global warming, how does one best apply the knowledge of history to a developing situation which appears to never having applied before, at least not on a global scale, the problem of climate change?
Sorry, I'm not sure
how would one apply the history to tackling the challenge of climate change, I think is the question.
Sorry, I'm slow on these. I think we need to look at other ways in which we have collectively worked together. As we have done in financial crises, as we have tried to do with the nuclear non-proliferation regime, I think it is possible for us to work together. It does take leadership. I think it takes leadership, but it also takes support from the grassroots. I mean, I think we're capable of doing it. We have worked on issues before. We've worked on when there has been a serious medical threat, a threat of epidemic. We have, in fact, I think, worked fairly successfully together, and I think these are examples that we can work together. What worries me about climate change is that it's just so enormous a problem that our temptation will be to sort of try and put our heads in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist. I mean, I think denialism is a very real and understandable human reaction, but doesn't help us. I mean, the number of people who apparently, according to polls I don't know if it's true in Canada, but in the United States, who don't believe that anything is happening if the climate is going up rather than down, in spite of the sort of anecdotal evidence which seems to suggest that summers are indeed getting hotter and storms are getting more violent and more frequent. But I think there's a responsibility on the individual to be parts of coalitions, because I do think pressure from the grassroots can make a difference, but I do think also there's a need for leadership on climate issues. What may happen is the crisis will reach such proportions that we will have to do something. When we're actually up against it, I mean, we may have to. And this is one we can't escape, and we can't pick up and move somewhere else. I mean, there's been a tradition in North America of picking up and moving. This time we can't. We've got one planet. And if it's in serious trouble, then we collectively have to deal with it. And there's some encouraging signs. I mean, it seems to me that China and India, which for some time you can understand why, we're saying, look, we didn't create the problem, why should we be part of the solution, are actually coming around to realizing that, yes, it's true they didn't create the problem, but they need to be part of the solution because they can't escape its consequences. So.
Great. Could those engaging Dr. MacMillan be, first of all, identify themselves, which would be great, and secondly, be relatively brief, if they would. Sir.
My name is Blaine Kennedy. I was actually going to ask a question similar to the one that was on the screen, but I'll add to that. It's because of climate change being so disruptive, and a lot of what you've been talking about in relating history is between nations and what happens between nations, but this may be one, the lack of resources and the global warming, that transcends that and gets it between rich and poor. And there's always been a belief of power relationships, and it seems that it's having the energy resources has underpinned a lot of the power relationships, and those aren't going to hold up. And one of the things that we do a lot of is issue that we can't have innovation or technology to solve the problems, but right now we're in a place in the world where efficiency, a different approach to what we need to consume, and particularly renewables, could allow us to get out of a lot of the problems we're going into. A lot of people like to think of it as global warming is warming, but the first consequence is the lack of water, particularly water for producing food. So we start to change all the relationships. And you were talking about how, it was the latter part of your lecture where you're talking about how people coped with these changes that took place. And I guess I'm wondering how we would apply that to the current leaderships of nations, or how are we going to get out of this conundrum when it's not just a little bit disruptive and nasty on the edges, it's fundamental.
Yeah. Well, I think if we were to get out of it, it's going to be a number of solutions, not one. I mean, I think there's no one big magic solution. I mean, I think there has to be international action, but it seems to me there also has to be, at the domestic level, there have to be really significant changes. And in some cases, they're coming. I mean, I notice it very much in Europe. I mean, well, just to begin with, gas is twice the price it is in Canada, which does lead you to think carefully about how you use it, and does lead, does lead to certain modifications of behavior. And there's tremendous public investment in cutting consumption of fuels, in using fuels more efficiently. I mean, there's a lot that can be done. And as I say, I think it's got to be done at different levels and in different ways. We, I think, are trying to find new technologies. I think we shouldn't expect they're going to solve everything. because I don't think they will, but we're finding new ways of doing things. I think we'll probably have to use more nuclear power. We'll have to be less profligate with what we have. The wastage in our energy consumption is very large. The wastage in our water consumption is large. I mean, they're going to have to be ways of dealing with it. We're going to have to modify our behavior, but we already have. I don't believe these are intractable problems. I mean, I think what is worrying is how much time we have, and it's difficult to tell. And I do find worrying this sort of attitude of not wanting to think about it. I mean, I was saying to people earlier today, I was at a dinner party and the climate change issue came up, and someone said very firmly, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in climate change. And it was an odd way of putting it, because it's not something you believe in or not believe, like Tinkerbell. It's something you have to take seriously, and you have to consider the evidence seriously. It's not something that can simply be wished away. And I think that may be a danger. But I think it's going to have to be at many levels. It's going to have to be a series of individual choices, but also collective choices. And there has to be a search for new forms of energy, new ways of using what we already have, ways of recycling what we have. And I think this is coming, but as I say, we may be forced to make the changes quicker than we'd like to think. If the changes continue as they seem to be, if they continue, if the polar ice caps continue to melt at the rate they're melting or increase, I think we'll begin to feel the effects much more quickly. This is not something, from what I understand, I'm no scientist, this is not something that is going to be sort of just a little bit different every year. The rate of change may speed up very dramatically, and that is something we're going to have to face. So,
Merci. Si vous avez une intervention.
If you do have a comment or a question in French, please feel free to ask your question in French, and Dr. MacMillan will either answer in French or in English. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Jaap Schouten, which is a somewhat unpronounceable Dutch name. And I've lived in Canada for 42 years. I'd like to try out an analogy on you, knowing the risks, of course. The major European powers, such as Britain and France and Germany, well, not so much Germany, Portugal, Holland, became very powerful, partly as a result of acquiring colonies overseas, rather than just bothering their neighbors. And I was wondering whether, in the current circumstances, there is a likelihood that this colonialism is restarting again, in particular with China colonizing Africa.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think part of what drove, and there's a huge debate that goes on among historians about whether empires ever actually paid for themselves and who profited. And the answer seems to be that a lot didn't. But that certain people profited a lot, that some people did very well out of them and others didn't, the general taxpayer didn't do that well. There was, I think part of what drove empire was a fear that if you didn't actually control a piece of land which contained, say, resources or cheap labor or was a site for investment, had potential for investment, if you didn't actually control it, if your flag wasn't flying over it, you wouldn't be able to get access to it. I mean, it's part of what drove Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this fear that it would be shut out of the resources of whatever sort that it needed. And then we went through, I mean, there are fashions, I think, in international relations, much as there are in other forms of human affairs, and we went through a period where colonies were seen to be a burden, they didn't seem to pay for themselves, they didn't seem necessary, you could get the resources you needed anyway by buying them. I mean, people with resources want to sell them. And so why do you actually need to bother to own the place? Why, if you want the oil, just buy it. And I think that was really a very strong feeling in the post-1945 years. And I think we're seeing now a sort of slight revival of this fear that if you don't actually own it or have some sort of legal right to it, you're going to be in trouble because others might try and shut you out. And we are seeing this interesting development, and it's not just China, it's a number of the Middle Eastern states as well, buying up large tracts of Africa that contain resources or use, I mean, in the case of the Gulf states, using them for agriculture. And it is interesting. It is a form, I suppose, of colonialism. It's one that we haven't, in a way, well, I suppose we had something similar when the British, for example, bought up big tracts of Latin America. They didn't actually control it, but they had access. They controlled a lot of the infrastructure. They controlled a lot of the ports. They controlled a lot of the raw materials. And I think we see the same thing. I suspect those who are buying tracts of, say, Ethiopia or Madagascar or wherever they're buying them, Kenya, I think, is another country. Sudan is also a place where considerable amounts of land and resources are being bought up, are going to run into the same sort of difficulties that the old colonial powers had. And they're going to find that they're going to have to put money in. They're going to be expected, as they already are, to build infrastructure in return for actually having access to these parts of the world. And they're also going to run into the difficulties of dealing with the locals. Already, I think, the Chinese are running into difficulties in Africa because in many cases what they do is bring in their own labor and they create compounds so that you will get a sort of Chinese-run mine using Chinese labor and Chinese materials and Chinese engineers, and the locals get very little benefit out of it. And so there is already something of a backlash and already something of a problem for the Chinese as they try and negotiate in Africa. But it is an interesting development, and I think one to watch, because I think it could lead to a good deal of tension, and it could lead to a new form of what was called in the 19th century the scramble for Africa.
Thank you.
Dr. MacMillan, my name is Jocelyn Sweet. I was a student of yours in Toronto for a time.
Oh, hello.
It's good to see you. I wonder, sort of building on this idea of resources, we're seeing, you're talking about balances of power and power shifting from two states equally matched to a bit more diversity of power brokers. Where, I guess I'm wondering, does the relationship between the corporation and the state, what are your thoughts on that in terms of how power is being balanced out?
Oh, it's a very interesting question, because we do have corporations that are in many cases bigger than, at least in economic terms, than individual states. But with very big states, I think even corporations are realizing that they're up against something formidable. I mean, you look at the experience of BP, very, very powerful, multinational corporation, but it's run straight up against the US government. And I would, we can all see who's been the winner in that one. And so I think the corporations do have tremendous capacity and tremendous power. And I think it is an issue for the world collectively about how to regulate them and regulate their operations. And I think, there are a number of very important initiatives in this to try and make corporations more accountable for what they do in less developed countries that don't have the capacities to deal with them, don't have the legal capacity, don't have the political capacity or the technological capacity to deal with some of these very powerful corporations. So it seems to me it's a combination of the two. I think the nation state, or the state rather, remains very important and has considerable power. But there are other actors in the world stage, and it's a question of how these powers not only intersect with each other and how they work with each other, but it's also how we collectively, as a society, deal with some of the power. I think, as I say, I think there are initiatives. Transparency International, I think, is important in trying to promote transparent and accountability by corporations. And there are a number of initiatives now that my colleague at St. Anthony's, Paul Collier, is involved in to try and make corporations working in Africa have to deal more openly with the governments of the countries in which they're dealing. There's some very interesting projects too where, for example, the government, I think it is, and I'm trying to remember which North African state it is, it may be Mali, it's a state that has discovered it has considerable oil, and it has actually called the Norwegians in for assistance in how to negotiate with big multinational corporations, which is a very sensible thing to do because the Norwegians have done it very successfully. And so it seems to me that there will always be a back and forth between very powerful economic entities and state power. I think that's, you've seen through history. You saw it in the 19th century, you saw it in the 20th century, and I don't think it's going to go away. But I wouldn't say that. I think it remains an interesting sort of tension. I don't think either side has won, and maybe neither side ever will win. It'll be back and forth.
Hello, Dr. MacMillan. My name is Matthew. I'd like to ask you a question sort of in your capacity as a teacher, and I guess particularly as a teacher of people who probably will be more than average influential in foreign affairs and international affairs in the future. And you touched on the topic of personal history and how that can affect people, and you talked about France as an example. But I imagine that would apply to generations as well. And so I'm 23 years old, for example, so I'm Generation Y, so I want to ask kind of a self-centered Generation Y question. But I wonder about the formative experiences of my generation, and as your experience as a teacher of people my age and people who have grown up in this era that you just described, this sort of post-9/11 era, which seems to be in a lot of ways different from what came before it. If you have any observations about how our worldview has been affected by our historical experiences, and maybe if that leads us to make any predictions about how, in the future, as we go on, we might sort of make policy or view the world.
What an interesting thought. I mean, you should not talk about your generation being selfish. Look, I come from the baby boom generation, which had the biggest sense of entitlement ever, I think, and probably still does. I mean, we now expect you to pay our pensions for the rest of your lives. I think it's very difficult to generalize about a generation, but I think the things that will affect your generation, and I see it with the students I used to see at the University of Toronto and now at Oxford, I think you're more anxious about jobs, more anxious about not, people aren't dropping out and going off and doing things quite as much as they used to. I think they're more concerned about what appears to be a contracting economy, about the possibility of getting jobs. And so I think there is an anxiety there, which there was, in the 60s when the economy was expanding, it was just assumed there would be jobs always, and that you had leisure and you had the opportunity to try a number of different things. So I think that is probably a constraint. I think you're more internationally minded than we were. I mean, I'm very struck, and St. Anthony's, of course, is a self-selected group because it's a very international college, but I'm very struck by how many of the students have lived and worked in other countries and are committed to continuing to do that. I don't see your generation as one that is solely focused on making money. I mean, there are always those who will be focused on making money, and sometimes lots of it. But there are also a lot of people who have a very strong sense of civic responsibility and a strong sense of wanting to help others. I mean, I'm struck. I mean, I don't think we had as many volunteer groups when I was at the University of Toronto. I mean, we had a lot of parties. And occasionally, I mean, no, we did have CUSO, Canadian University Service Overseas, and we had a couple of other things. But I mean, when I was at Trinity, I was amazed at the variety of activities students were involved in, and tutoring students whose literacy were problems, or math skills were problems, working in other parts of the world, but also working in Toronto. So I mean, I think your generation is an interesting one. I mean, I think you probably got anxieties which we didn't have. But then we probably had anxieties you didn't have. I mean, we every so often worried about, nuclear war. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I remember we all sat there and watched Kennedy's speech, and we all thought, well, that's it, And then we remembered there was a party that night, so we went to that. We thought, well, life goes on, and we thought if we were going to be blown to smithereens, we might as well enjoy ourselves. So I think it's mixed, and I think in any generation you will get those who have a strong sense of obligation and responsibility to others, and those who don't, or those who want to follow a particular career and those who don't. So, but I do think, you are in a difficult time when it comes to finding jobs. I don't know if that's something you all worry about, but it seems to me there is an anxiety out there.
I have a job, but I know that a lot of my friends, it's definitely something on people's minds. So.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Now, thank you for that. I think we can take the 3 remaining questioners if they're willing to be relatively brief, but I won't encourage anybody else to come up to the microphones. Madame?
Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Sarah. I have a quick question to make, but before making that question, one thing that I would like to say is that I've read a lot about the 21st century thinkers on the issues of power, and I'm using that a lot in my academic writing. So what impressed me about your lectures that you've talked a lot about the power access, the location, and the exercise of power differently. And I would like to find out from you how best can Africa, I'll talk about Africa because I'm African, so it's always nice to talk about something that you know best. How best do you think maybe you can inform Africa when it comes to the issues of power, looking at the fact that I would say the African histories are more buried than live. So if you use the buried histories that are not there, and yet some countries are trying to revive from these histories and use them on the world stage, are you not seeing anything that can maybe in the long run create a problem when we tend to forget about what happened to Africa in the past centuries? To bring you, I mean, just to give you an example, we can take Zimbabwe, we can take South Africa with its own past histories, which maybe to some extent we would like not to think about. So how best can we use those histories to inform us today as we get into the new practices? And also at the same time, how best can we move ahead and try to see how Africa can always be included in the world stage? Because my worry is, as I was listening, every time maybe some lectures are on the table, Africa does not come out, as you all know, I would say it doesn't really reflect a good image. But it's also worrisome because of the Western ideals that in a lot of cases were imported to Africa. So these are very worrying effects that are in place. So I just want to know how best can history inform the practices in Africa in general as a continent, not as a country. Thank you.
I think it's a very complicated question and a very good one. I mean, I think you must find it very frustrating. I certainly do, looking at it from outside, that the image of Africa and so much of the outside world focuses entirely on things going wrong and doesn't focus on the number of countries which are building strong societies, building strong democracies, which are experiencing considerable economic growth, which are dealing with education, really getting a lot of people into school, building technology. The press outside Africa seems to focus on disasters and slums and problems, and I think this is I don't know whether this is a hangover from colonialism. It seems to me to give a very false impression of a very complicated continent. I mean, even to talk about Africa, it's to try and treat it as a whole seems to me to make no more sense than to talk about Latin America as a whole. And so I think we need to know more about Africa. But as far as Africans themselves are concerned, I think many of the solutions are in their hands. And I think what you're seeing is a younger generation of Africans who are taking matters into their own hands. I think there was an understandable period as many African states became independent without really the structures or adequate structures and without the sort of capacity to manage their own independence. There was a tendency to blame it all on colonialism, and certainly colonialism can be blamed for a lot, including some of the very odd boundaries which divide Africa up. But I think it seems to me in a way that the younger generation in Africa has moved beyond that and said, look, what's left from the past is what we're stuck with. There's no will in Africa, I think rightly, to try and change those boundaries, and let's get on with it. And yes, colonialism did pretty awful things to much of Africa, but the time has now come to move beyond that. And I think that is, a necessary psychological step. It doesn't mean you ignore the history. I think you have to accept the history. It is there. But I think Africans increasingly are taking control of their own worlds, and they're writing their own history. And I think this is a very good thing. I mean, for a while, a lot of the history of Africa was being written by people who, with the best will in the world, weren't themselves Africans, and a lot of them did very good work. But there was a tendency to write about the history of Africa from outside. And I think Africans are now writing about their own history. I mean, I think the thing that's always important in history is to be honest about it. Not to create wonderful stories about how we were always right or we were always this or always that. To accept, that the history of, say, Nigeria is a complicated history. There was a civil war, not to push that under the table. There were periods of perhaps less than competent military rule. There were periods when one region was fighting another region. It's necessary, I think, to accept that and to try and understand it, because if you try and ignore it, then you have no hope of avoiding it another time. I mean, I think you need to understand when things went wrong and get some sense of why they went wrong. I think the same thing with South Africa. I mean, I think the history of South Africa is very important and very complicated, and it's necessary for all Africans to understand that history. I mean, I think history, and I think South Africa is a very good example of this. History can, in fact, be something of a healer if you can explore it, and you can, both sides, or if there are sides, can say, look, let's accept that this happened. I think it builds a healthier society. I think if you try and ignore what happened in the past, I think you leave it festering under the surface, and that's not good. I mean, painful as it is, I think it's better to get it out and try and cope with it. But I think, I mean, I find what I hear about from the Africanists at my own college is really a very hopeful story and a very interesting story, and a story which is much more complex. You know, that recognize that there are tremendous differences within African countries and from one African country to another. And I wish more of that story were understood outside Africa, because I think it's a very important story. But I think the most important story is for the Africans to understand it themselves and to know about themselves.
Jerry Wright.
Yeah,
Margaret, I was struck by your mention of the difficulty the Chinese have facing up to the Maoist experience. And I couldn't help but wondering about the role that non-national historians would play in bringing that about, in getting a country or getting a society to look more frankly at its own history. I think, for example, in respect of Asia, of historians like John Fairbank on China or Edwin Reischauer on Japan, both of whom wrote very frankly and objectively about their respective countries. With what effect on those countries, I'm not at all sure. What are the prospects that, in the case of the societies of some of the emerging powers today, non-national historians will be able to penetrate their consciousness?
It's a tricky question. I mean, I think what often happens is that the historian from outside can be more honest about what happened, about a tricky subject, but they don't always get thanked for it. I mean, the first person really to explore what Vichy France did, to destroy the myth that all the French really were in the resistance, and to point out that a great many people supported the collaborationist government in Vichy France, and not just supported it, but there were those who enthusiastically worked for Vichy and worked with the Germans and enthusiastically rounded up the Jews when the Germans asked them to and shipped them off to the death camps. The first person to do that was Robert Paxton, an American. And for a long time, he was vilified in France. I mean, there was a sort of nationalist closing of ranks, and what does he know about us? He doesn't understand us. We're a very complicated country. He's got it all wrong. Gradually, however, other French historians began to pick up the story and began to carry on his work. And it was not easy. But I think sometimes perhaps an historian from outside who is less subject to the pressures of society. I mean, it's difficult if you live in a society and people say, well, you know, we'll never speak to you again. You are no longer a member of this family for writing these terrible things about us. There are those sorts of pressures. And so it may be that the historian from outside can look at it in a more dispassionate way and can free himself or herself from the nationalist myths. I mean, the Chinese have a very strong sense of history, but it's tended to be a strong sense of history which treats China in a certain way, treats it, for example, as a continuity, argues there's always been a China that is somehow essentially unchanging, which I don't think is the case. And it's sometimes taken outside historians to ask the awkward questions about where is the evidence for this. And so I think you're right. I think historians from outside can sometimes be very helpful and very useful in opening up questions which might be more difficult for those inside a country to open up. But you also get it, you get something which can happen. I mean, I think it's happened with some of the China scholars from the West, is that there's also a problem that if you want to open up the awkward questions, you may not be able to go back. And that can be a constraint. I mean, there are different kinds of constraints on doing history. You know, you want to get into archives, you have to get on well with the authorities. And if you ask the awkward questions and use those archives to raise awkward issues, next time you want a permit to go, you may not get it. So it's not all that easy. I mean, but I think history is, I mean, I see historians as essentially pains in the neck. We ask difficult questions, and that's what we should be doing. You know, we're not the sort of people you want to have at a dinner party because we say, well, it wasn't exactly like that. You know, we don't, I'm sorry, but I really can't agree with that because there's this evidence. You know, we're sort of tedious like that, but I do think it's a necessary thing. Maybe not at dinner parties, but occasions like this. Yeah.
Sam, if you can be very quick.
I will. I'd like to come back to your discussion of the uses and misuses of appeasement, both as a tactic and as an analogy. There's a joke about an endemically corrupt police force in which an honest cop is defined as one who stays bought. So I suppose an honest dictator would be one who stays appeased. But does this type exist either in history or in the present day?
Someone who is appeased gets a legitimate, or what could be a legitimate. Well, Stalin didn't actually, once he got Eastern Europe, he stopped. Now, it was dreadful for the Eastern Europeans, but he didn't want more. Now, his long-term goal may have been to expand. Ataturk, who was a dictator, got part of Mosul, which he wanted, in very difficult negotiations with the British, and he didn't ask for more. He didn't ever try and rebuild the Ottoman Empire. He accepted the boundaries that he'd been given, but he did want the Turkish parts within. So yes, I think there have been cases where appeasement has worked, where people have wanted something passionately and have got it. I mean, you could argue that the unification of Italy, the Italians got what they wanted and didn't really try and push much beyond their national ethnic boundaries. I'll have to try and think of other examples. It's an interesting question, so thank you. Good one to end on.
Great. Well, thank you very much, those of you who came tonight, those who watched on your screens. Above all, thank you, Margaret. It was an absolutely fascinating evening. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.